Hello, class. And today we're simply going to briefly review some of our history from chapter 6, as well as our geography map, and then we're going to go on to the next chapter and keep going so that we are ready and prepared for, there is an upcoming exam coming. So we want to be ready for our test as well as an upcoming exam. So do you know all of these? I hope so. You know them without looking. We've got New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. See the line here that divides it? Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. I hope I didn't get cut off there. Did you see that? Okay, so that is the map. Let's see if you know without looking. This is, did you say New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. And I hope that you know all of them very well. And you need to know those. There's going to be a map that you will see on your test. And let me ask you a few questions so that you are ready and prepared. What sort of people settled Georgia? They were mostly what? They were prisoners, weren't they? And poor people. Who settled New Jersey? Did you say the Dutch? What famous preacher went to Georgia to start America's first orphanage? Did you say George Whitefield? Who gave New Jersey its name? Did you say Sir George Carteret and Lord John Berkeley? What colony was founded by William Penn? And I hope you said Pennsylvania. Can you list the middle colonies? New York, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Can you list the southern colonies? See, we've got Virginia, we've got North Carolina, we've got South Carolina, we've got Georgia. Working our way down the map. Who was the explorer hired by the Dutch to explore New York? And his name was Henry Hudson. Just a few sample questions of the kinds of things you will see on a test. So study chapter 6 for a test. We're going to go ahead and go on and look at the next chapter. Actually, the next chapter in your book is a wonderful chapter all about a picture of colonial life. Oh, what was it like to live back then? What was it like to do the things that they did then? And so I'm going to try to get it to where you can actually see the book a little better, okay? So here we are at our new chapter 7. This is an exciting chapter. It's really an interesting chapter. And a lot of historical places are mentioned that you could actually go to learn about colonial life. For example, here are some examples of homes from the New England and Middle colonies. And there are actually some historical places that you could go see. I know we all think of some of the colonial places such as like Williamsburg and even Jamestown settlements that you could go, and you could actually go into the houses and see things that look very similar to this, can't you? And it just shows like a colonial kitchen, and look at how they had to cook over the fireplace, or they had to use the spinning wheel, and on the hours and hours that women would spend doing things like that, as well as cooking. And so it was a different way of life than now, wasn't it? And that's what the first part talks about. Life in colonial America was very different than the way it is now. Yet the way that they lived back then influenced the way we live now. So one thing affects the other. Homes. First, they had these cabins, crude homes, quickly built because they didn't have time to spend a lot of time when they had to get things in the ground to eat. And so then later they would build more permanent homes. Soon larger, nice houses began to dot the American countryside, and the one-room cabins began to disappear. Again, it was all one room at the beginning. I can't help but think of the Little House on the Prairie and all of those books, and they even made movies of it. And how at first there was Ma, Pa, Laura, and then her sisters, and they just had one big cabin, and they all lived in, it was just one room. And then later they upgraded. They built some separate rooms. And that's how it was. That's how this life was. This is colonial life. I know that was a little later, but it was very similar in that westward expansion, going and starting over. Building a new house was quite a task, though. You know what they had to do? Well, it took a lot of work, but they didn't have to do it all by themselves. And that is something I wish we had more even today, is this sense of community, where they would have their village of people and they would go say, hey, I need a house. Let's have a house raising. Notice the bold term there. What does it mean? Well, it means neighbors and others would all come help cut down trees. And then they would take the wood from the trees and make it into lumber to build the new home. And they raised the house. In other words, they made it go up. They raised the house from bottom to top, everyone pitching in. And a colonist would even have to build all of his own furniture unless he had bought a few pieces over from Europe, or brought a few pieces over from Europe. And so that means that it was hard to do. They had to make the stuff or find someone who could make it. But most of the time they built these houses, they just looked like copies of the home in Europe because that's what they were used to. And so over time, though, there were some unique designs to America. Look at this guy here. See this instrument he's holding? Okay. A froe was used to split logs to make lumber. Then colonists would use the lumber to build such things as tables, benches, and chairs. And so it would split the logs into like boards, help to make boards and lumber. Moving on, we see inside colonial houses, they were simple. They're usually just two large beds, a table with benches, usually not chairs at first. Benches were much faster and easier to make. But maybe there were a couple pieces of furniture that would have bowls and plates, spoons, forks. They were carved out of wood mostly at the beginning. Candles gave light for the cabin, as well as the huge fireplace. And one thing about it being one big room is that big fireplace would create light and heat, particularly in the winter time. You know, it was cold, and the bigger your house, the harder it would be to heat. Well, the fireplace was used for cooking and heating, thinking of the winter time. As you can see, colonists did not enjoy the luxuries we have today. But for almost every colonist, life in America was far better than life in Europe. And the colonists were willing to work hard to make life in America even better. They said, even though this is hard, at least we have the freedom that we were seeking in this new land. Now, during the day, most of the men in the colonies were busy farming or hunting. So they're working on their farm. The wives were very busy as well. And one of the most important jobs was to make clothes. They had to make their clothes for the family. And they would use the spinning wheel, like I had said before in this other picture over here. And they would use a spinning wheel to make the threads from. Maybe it's wool, maybe it's cotton. And this spinning wheel would turn the raw materials into these long strands of fibers, like thread. And then they would twist and twist and twist together to make these strands or fibers, threads. And then they would have to put those on a loom and weave them into cloth. Then they'd have to sew them all together and make clothes. So it's a long process there, wasn't it? You'd spin sheep's wool into yarn. See? Then she would use a loom to make rough gray material called homespun from the yarn. So our book here mentions wool, but you could also use other fibers. Homespun, meaning it was made and spun at home, makes sense. And it was not glorious, okay? It was used especially for shirts, dresses, and pants. Deer skin would also be available for making clothes if the husband was a good hunter. The richer colonists avoided wearing homespun clothes. They bought the latest fashions in Europe instead. So homespun was more, homely, more, the poor folks definitely would be doing that. And the richer that could afford to buy the nicest, newest fashions bought it from Europe. But I would say the common family, just a common family, would be making homespun. Look, at night, colonial families usually gathered around the fireplace, perhaps to work on some project such as making candles or stitching a quilt together or cooking molasses candy. So their time together, instead of watching television or playing some game, they're together, they're making something because they gotta live. And but it becomes a group activity. It becomes a fun thing. It's like if you this weekend encourage you, okay, ask your parents, okay, let's make something together. Let's make cookies together. Let's make a cake together. Let's make homemade bread together. Ooh, I wonder how that would be. Or let's make some homemade meal together and it be a group activity and you could experience it's fun when you're doing it together and you're making something and then you can eat it together or whatever it is. So no radio, television. So they would talk about the news. They would talk about what's going on around them. Maybe there was trouble with Indians or rumors of war with England, whatever's happening, just a lot of talking together. Some colonial towns had newspapers, but most colonists got the news from town criers. Think of the word crier, like to cry out. It means to yell something, doesn't it? Help, cried Susie. She was in trouble, right? The town criers, they were men who were paid by the city to wander about the streets and call out the latest news. So instead of a newspaper, they'd cry out the biggest topic of the day because there weren't many newspapers. There were not many newspapers yet. So the colonists also heard the news in their churches on Sunday. The pastor would make announcements and tell you about what's going on. In most homes, the Bible was read aloud every night. Other books such as Pilgrim's Progress, John Fox's Book of Martyrs were also widely read. But the Bible was the most important book for most colonists, and you should highlight that. The Bible, the most important book, and highlight town criers. What are they? Now, this is a copy of the Boston Newsletter, which began in 1704, was America's first newspaper. Newspapers replaced town criers in American cities. So before the newspapers, they had the town criers, but then they had the newspapers. And you can see in your book on page 73, a facsimile of exactly what it was. This is from April 24th, 1704. This is exactly what the newspaper looked like that day. And very interesting. Churches, most settlers came to America. They came because they wanted to worship God freely. So in America, once freedom of religion was allowed, no one had to worship secretly. So many places, even today, you have to worship secretly. But in America, it was allowed. So there were large public houses of worship. They were built through the colonies to worship in their churches. And the church buildings were also used for town meetings, where meetings of government were discussed. So again, earlier we talked about something called like a common house, where it had more than one use. And it was similar to that they would use it for other things too. Okay. Sometimes there'd even be a school inside of the church. And so the ideas of political freedom and religious freedom were discussed in these buildings. Can you hear me all right? Hope everyone it's picking up all right and you can hear me. New England was a land filled with churches. At first, most were Puritan churches. The churches that were started were Puritan churches, but then of course, later there were other kinds of churches that were built. Here's a church in New England, just a simple box, basically, with windows and a nice big door. And interesting how the churches changed in their look. So the first settlers of New England built churches that, like their homes, were plain and simple. It just looks like a house, doesn't it? Big, though, big. They were well built, and some of them were still in use today. As more and more people came to New England, changes took place. Larger, more decorative congregational Puritan churches were built. Other religious groups, Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, these groups, Jews, many others, built meeting houses in New England. So by the end of the colonial period in 1776, New England had changed from land dominated by Puritans to a place where people of many faiths could live and worship. For a long time, however, all the people in some New England colonies had to pay taxes to the Congregational Church where they belonged, or whether they belonged to it or not. And that did not make some of them happy. Notice that it says the end of the colonial period was 1776. Why? Why is that the end? Why is 1776 the end of the colonial period? What happened then? Yes, did you say that we had this war for independence where the colonies become free of England? So they're no longer colonies, they become states and their own country, the United States of America. So colonial comes from the word colony, right? It would end in 1776. The settlers who built their homes in the middle colonies represented many different religions. So we had mentioned the Quakers, one of them. They came to the middle colonies to escape persecution they had faced in England. And then there were other groups, including the Mennonites, which were also similar as far as plain and strict in their beliefs, and maybe even considered extreme by many around them. Presbyterians, Baptists, Anglicans, Dutch Reformed, all different kinds of churches that were being formed at this time. And look, here's a picture of how the church changed. They became more elaborate, not just a box, but hey, now we've got this steeple. We might even have a bell tower with a clock on it, getting a little more elaborate with our building gradually. Now, because the Southern colonists planted large farms that separated Southern families from each other, the Southern colonies had fewer churches. So in New England, lots of churches. Southern, lots of farms. Well, if you have a big farm, you're not as close to each, but your next door neighbor might be a mile away, 2 miles away, right? So, or much further distance anyway. And so it was hard for them to get together. There weren't as many churches. And so families would have to travel miles each Sunday just to meet together. So therefore, the traveling preacher was born. And these traveling preachers would go around rather than having churches, and they would bring the religion, the word to the colonists. And the preacher would just go to where they are. And sometimes an Anglican church, Church of England, the Church of England is known as the Anglican Church. The priest would travel around to farms and perform an Anglican service for the many Southerners who belonged to the Church of England. Later, men called circuit riding preachers traveled on horseback throughout the South, preaching the Bible, and great revivals broke out. This is very interesting how God used these circuit riding preachers. Circuit meaning they would start in one spot, then they go to the next place, then they go to the next place, then they go to the next place, then they go to the next place till they made their full circuit, and they'd start over again. So you might not have a preacher every Sunday, but every few weeks he'd be back to where you are. And then on the off Sundays, there would maybe just be some families that were closer together that just met in someone's house, or maybe it was just your family meeting together, worshiping God together. Now, going to church was the important part of the week in colonial America. Little, if any, work was done on Sunday. The Sabbath was a special time that all the people honored. They didn't believe in doing other things on those days much. And it was just no work, no going out in the fields and farming, stuff like that. Now, the different churches worshiped in different ways, but the services usually included singing the church. So they'd have a singing time. And then there, of course, would be a preaching time, Bible reading, a very long sermon, very long sermon. In fact, most of the services lasted over 2 hours, sometimes longer than 3 hours long. So you can imagine after 3 hours, here's little Susie here falling asleep. And the preacher is standing up on this tall pulpit, stairs going up in some of these churches. But this was a typical picture of inside a colonial church. Very typical inside. Such long services were bound to cause people to snooze, but a man strolling through the congregation made sure that everyone stayed awake. He had a pole with which he poked anyone who closed his eyes. How would you like that? So he'd have a pole, and he would, if you started to nod off, so like this girl here, he'd take the pole and he'd just poke you. Wake up, don't go to sleep. And that was something, wasn't it? Next time we're going to talk about schools in colonial America. What 2 uses did the fireplace provide for colonial homes? Do you remember that one? Oh, did you say number one, they cooked with it, and number two, they heated with it? What was the rough gray material made by colonial women? So it was homemade material. It was called, you remember? Homespun. Homespun. Why was news given by town criers or in church during colonial days? Why? Because they didn't have what? They didn't have newspapers yet. And they certainly didn't have television or radio. Number 4, what was the most important book in the colonial homes? I hope all of you said the Bible, because that is the correct answer. Next time we'll continue, we'll go on, we'll talk about schools. So I hope you were listening. I hope you learned something today as we reviewed and started chapter 7, which will be included on the exam up to chapter 7. We're going to go ahead. We went ahead and read this part so that we can keep going, because today we would have actually had a test. So we're going to review chapter 6 when we come back. And then we're going to read a little bit in chapter 7. We'll have our chapter 6 test. And then in the following week, we'll have an exam, and it'll cover all the way through chapter 7. So hope you're watching this and learning. And remember, learn something new every day.